right, we are Materials, Real Estate Law for Paralegals, Chapter 5, learn about non-possessory interest. Part 1, we're going to learn about easements. So we've been talking about owning real property and our rights in real property. We've also looked at the lesser estates, right? Not full ownership, but some lesser estate or interest in real property. And we looked at encumbrances in Chapter 4. We looked at the public regulations through zoning and taxes, and we also took a look at some private ones, liens. And so now we're going to take a look at easements. So what is an easement? This is the right of a non-owner of real property to use the real property of another for a specific purpose. So, right, this is one of our sticks in the bundle, the right of use and enjoyment. That's our right or your right, and you can give that right to someone else because that's your right, and you can do that. You can share it with another, and an easement is one way to do that. So the two kinds of easements, a pertinent and engross. So an pertinent easement is one that benefits a particular piece of property. So you have two parts of a pertinent easement. You have the dominant estate and the servient estate. So the dominant estate is the piece of land that's going to be benefited by the easement. And the servient estate is the piece of land that where the easement is located and that serves the other parcel of land. So how does an easement pertinent work? So let's say you have two pieces of land that are next to a road. This piece is owned by Meg, and this one by Stewie. Well, clearly Stewie cannot get to the road, which he wants to do, right? That's how he's going to be able to use his land, is to get to the road. Otherwise, he can't get to it. So he's going to ask Meg for an easement to cross her property. So sometimes this is called, well, just an access easement, right? Because he's using it to access his property. But sometimes you'll see these strange words, ingress and egress. That just means to enter and to exit. So Stewie's property is going to be the dominant estate because it gets the benefit of the easement. And Meg's property is going to be the servient estate because that's where the easement is located, and her property serves the other. So you might ask yourself, well, isn't it Stewie that's getting to use that easement, right? Why is it the dominant estate? How is it tied to the property? Well, if Stewie sells to Peter, now Peter gets to use that easement. Stewie doesn't get to use the easement anymore, so the easement wasn't tied to Stewie. Now Peter gets to use it because Peter owns the property. And if Peter sells it to someone else, they'll get to use the easement, and so on and so forth. Same thing can be said if Stewie kept the property and Meg sold to Peter, right? Stewie just keeps to use the property or use the easement, and Peter has to let him. Peter can't do anything about it. He bought it subject to that easement. This is something called running with the land. When an easement carries on, right, and it always benefits the parcel, it's called running with the land. So whoever buys it later in time is still going to be subject to that easement because it runs with the land. So the next type of easement is an easement in gross. So what is an easement in gross? Well, this is one that doesn't benefit a particular piece of property, but it is connected to a person or more likely some entity, like a utility company. So what is an easement in gross, or how does it work? So imagine we have this subdivision. And this subdivision is full of houses. And these houses are full of people who like to use and enjoy their homes. They like to flush the toilet, right? They love indoor plumbing. It's so wonderful. They love to have running water to drink and to bathe in. Right? They love to use and enjoy their homes. But how can they use and enjoy their homes with these fine amenities? Right? If we didn't have them, we'd still be using outhouses and fetching water out of the well, or maybe running down to the creek, something like that. So how do we get these utilities? How do we get water and plumbing to this neighborhood, to these homes? Well, you do it by an easement in gross. And so you give the water company an easement to run pipe through the yard, to bring water to your home. Like to flush your toilet? Well, how do you think the waste gets out of your house? Through pipes. And where does those pipes go? They have to go into the yard. And how does that happen? Well, you have to give the sewer company an easement, to put their pipes through the yard, out to the street. You like to have power in your house, right? You like electricity, you like to turn on your TV, you tune in for class on your computer. Well, you have to have power. Power company gets an easement. You want phone or cable or internet? Those guys need an easement too. This is how we get all the things that we like to the house. Is all these people have easements. There's wires, there's cords, there's pipes, all running underneath your home and your apartments, and it's all easements. So how do we create an easement? Well, there's a couple of different ways. An express grant, implication, necessity, and prescription. So the easiest one is write an express easement. You write it down. I give you an easement for this purpose, to cross my property. We can also have an easement by necessity. And this is an easement that's created because you have to have it in order to use a piece of property, right? Without this easement, you can't get to your property. It would be useless because otherwise you have to trespass across somebody else's property, so you can't get there. So how does it work? Well, then we have an implied easement. This one is an easement created when the parties are situated in a manner that the easement is created without expressing any language, right? It's based on the circumstances. And then we have a prescriptive easement. And this is an easement that's created when a person uses the property of another without permission over a period of time, much like adverse possession, but it's adverse possession for an easement. Okay, so now, how does an easement by necessity work? Well, let's say we got old Carter Pewterschmidt and he's getting sick. He has some land that he wants to get rid of before he croaks. So he's going to give it to his family. So he divides it up, gives a portion to his daughter Lois, another portion to Peter. He hooks Brian and Stewie up, gives Chris a little something, And of course, he doesn't want to be unfair, but he doesn't like Meg because nobody does. So he gives her this piece in the middle. It's absolutely useless piece of land in the middle of everybody else's. So Peter is going to give Stewie and Brian access across his property so they can get to the road. So that means these guys are going to be the dominant estate. Peter's going to be the servient estate. And Lois is going to give Chris an easement across her property to get to the road. Right? Dominant, servient. But no one's going to give Meg access because, well, no one likes Meg. So she's going to basically have to sue Peter and Lois as well, and ask the court to say, I need an easement to get to my property. I can't use my property. I can't get from the road to my property because I have to cross somebody else's land and trespass. I can't do that. So you need to give me an easement. And so the court will grant, say, hey Lois, hey Peter, one of you guys, let Meg use, the access. And so that's how an easement by necessity is created. All right, what about an implied easement? Let's say we got Farmer Joe, and he's got a dairy farm full of cows, but he's getting up there in age and thinking about retiring, calling it quits. So along comes some hippies that love cows and farms and wanna buy it. They want to open up a hippie cheese factory and say, "Hey, Farmer Joe, we wanna move in." Farmer Joe says, "That's excellent." So he sells them the farm, but he portions it off and he decides he's going to stay up on the front 20 acres up by the road. So he splits it off, sells them the rest, puts himself up a little house, puts in a new driveway. He decides he's going to bring his favorite cow, Bessie, over. And he's going to put up a fence. Well, now the hippies can't use that road to get out to the farm, right? So they're going to have to sue, and the court's going to say, Farmer Joe, you need to move your fence back, not block the road because they have an implied easement. You were using that road to get to the farm when you sold it, and so the hippies thought that they were going to be able to use that road because you were using it when you sold it to them. You can't block it. They have an implied easement now that says they can use that road. All right, the next one is a prescriptive easement. So what is a prescriptive easement? Well, this is when you are granted an easement because you've done something for so long without permission that now you can do it legally, right? It's like adverse possession for an easement. It has the same requirements, open and notorious, right? You have to use the easement like someone who had an easement would use it. You actually have to use the easement. It has to be continuous for whatever statutory period of time is. And it has to be hostile, right? It means without consent. So the owner can't say, "Oh, sure, you can go across my lot in order to get down to the lake." They have to say, "No, you can't use my lot," or not know about it at all. It has to be hostile. So if you meet those requirements, then you can create an easement by prescription. All right, so how do you terminate an easement? Well, the easiest way is to just do a written release, right? You write a document that says this easement is terminated. Or you can make an easement expire, right? You can do that a couple different ways. You can do it on a date. You say your easement expires on February 15th, 2099. So now you have an easement for what, 74 years. You could tie it to an event, right? Like someone's death. You can have an easement until you die, right? Or until grandma dies, or until your dog Fido dies. You could even tie it to some event like the first overtime game in Super Bowl history, or the first time a team blows a 25-point lead in a Super Bowl to lose. Right? You could tie your easement to that, and if you did, then you would have most recently lost your easement, or it would have terminated. So, but you can do that. You can tie it to some event, and when that event occurs, the easement terminates. Then we have this thing called merger. So remember when Stewie lived next door to Meg, and he had an access easement across her property to get to the road. Let's say Meg wants to sell her property and Stewie buys it. Well, now Stewie owns both of the pieces of property. Well, Stewie doesn't need an easement to cross his own property because it's his. He can cross that property anywhere he wants to. He can do anything he wants to with that property. So the easement terminates because the dominant estate and the serving estate merge into one, and the easement goes away. The next one is abandonment, right? So let's say we have the same situation, right? Stewie has this access easement over Meg's property to get out to the main road. But then some years later, they build a super highway over on Stewie's side. And so Stewie says, well, heck, I can just jump right out onto the super highway now. I don't need to use your access to get out to that main road because I've got super highway in front of me. And so over time, eventually, if he stops using it, then it'll terminate by abandonment. It's quite likely in this situation that Meg is going to come say, hey, Stewie, I need an easement from you so I can get to the super highway, right? All right. So this go around, we just talked about easements, the two kinds of easement, pertinent and engrossed, and how they are created and terminated. Stay tuned for more, chapter 5.